Okay. Okay.
Hey there. I'm so excited. I'm Monika Kelly. We're here with another episode of Green Light and talking today to Trisha Fenimore. She's got a testimony. There's so many things about you that I can't even cover everything in like one introduction. But I'm super excited about your book. I'm like serious page turner. Pray for them.
Thank you.
Tell me about you.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for inviting me on your podcast. What an absolute privilege. Super excited to be here. And yeah, so I have not always been a Christian. I'll just dive right in because that's what people know me as now. I run a Christian Instagram account. My memoir that just came out a couple weeks ago is a Christian book. But I actually was an atheist for a really long time, basically from the age 11 on to about the age of 23. And so, my experience with Christianity is a little bit different. I joke that I'm not exactly a preacher's daughter, and if you've read my book, you know that well. I didn't grow up having this great faith. And so I always want to encourage people that just because you haven't had a faith, if you've had a faith and lost your faith, it's always possible to grow closer to God. And that's what I try to help people do through any way that I'm able, whether that's Instagram, whether that's writing, whether that's speaking. I've had the privilege to do all of that. And to share the glory of God is the greatest privilege of all. And that's what I try to do.
It's funny because I first ran across you on Instagram. It was a suggested reel, and you were talking about being an addict and needing God, and like just desperately needing God. And if you didn't need God, if you could just do it on your own, that you wouldn't. I mean, first of all, I don't even know if that's really addiction. And I'm speaking from personal experience because God has taken me for the last 30 years away from a serious alcohol addiction, one day at a time. It's not one of those, I was delivered 30 years ago and I'm good to go. And it's like, it's an ongoing thing, but, and absolutely need God. So that jumped out at me. And then I started following you. And then you were talking about your book, and you were talking about how you were a self-proclaimed racist who was called the Black Seminary. And I'm curious about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, on the topic of your podcast title, Green Light, when God tells you to go, you need to go. I have tried to do that in my own life, no matter how unexpected the path may be that God has told me to go in. So first, just to back up a little bit, I have been sober by the grace of God since 2011. And yeah, I think every different phase of sobriety has its own kind of unique challenges and nuances and struggles in a lot of ways. And I see God through all of them. Just a real quick story. My husband and I were celebrating 4 years of marriage back in December, and we went out for this beautiful evening, this great dinner. And normally I'll have him try my mocktails at a dinner or anything, just to make sure. He'll take the first sip just as like a litmus test and make sure that nothing, but somehow I think like the waiter dropped off my new like virgin mojito, and we were enthralled in this conversation, and I reached over and I took a sip, and there was alcohol in it. And it's like, 11 and a half years sober, and what do? And it's like, I spit it out and I went to the bathroom and washed my mouth out while praying fervently. But yeah, so I have experience walking out on the water with God into unfamiliar territory with addiction and sobriety, and leaning on him. I mean, completely, I wouldn't even say heavily, I would say completely in addiction. And that's what really brought me from the path of an atheist to a believer. But when talking about then my journey, so I went from atheist to believer to seminary student, which, I mean, believe you me, had you told me my life's trajectory at the age of 19, when I was, this sarcastic, cynical atheist who would mock anyone who believed in anything, I would laugh in your face. But, pride goeth before the fall, right? And so, it's funny, too, because, I joke in the book, there's a part where I talk about how I was enrolled in this gifted class when I was young. But then later in the book, I say, like, I didn't realize that God had called me to a predominantly Black seminary in Harlem, New York, to deal with the racism in me that he had already been dealing with. Like, I just thought I was supposed to go to seminary school and become a pastor, and that was the school he wanted me. Like, I joke in the book, I'm like, I may have been called gifted, but I'm not always too bright. So like, before I was called to seminary, I was praying daily about my racism for over a year, and practicing new ways of being in this world and going where God led me, in certain devotionals that would talk about, all of these things, they that plow wickedness and iniquity can expect likewise to be returned to them, basically what you sow, you reap. And it's like, I needed to address, if I'm sowing hatred, even not, while I was still drinking and an active addiction, it came out more. But even once getting sober, and even after becoming a Christian, it was still these little interactions where if I looked at the motive, if I looked at my heart, was it rooted in love, or was there some sort of strange, unexplainable hostility there in certain interactions in society? And so for me, it was addressing those. And in the process, I was in this job that I hated. Oh, I hated selling insurance. I hated a lot of jobs, but selling insurance might have been the one top of the list. So this mentor of mine, this Christian mentor of mine, was like, you have to figure out what God wants you to do with your life. Like, it's clearly not what you're doing. Like, you're unhappy. No one's happy with you selling insurance, and if you are called to sell insurance, please know I'm not judging you. I'm just saying that is not my calling in this life. And so I prayed, and I felt God say, I felt this understanding that, like, I'm supposed to be a pastor, and as a woman, like a single woman in her late 20s who was deeply in debt. And, I had a lot going on, which I'm sure you've read in the book. There's a lot of issues that God was bringing me through in that particular period in my life. But what's so interesting is, so in that job that I couldn't stand, we were given these lists of massive companies to reach out to about insurance, and nobody was having any luck. I was working with seasoned salespeople of this type of insurance who'd done this job for decades. None of them had any traction, except I did, with one account. And it was this crazy sale that, like, literally through the grace of God happened, as in conjunction with God calling me to seminary and me being like, well, how am I going to afford seminary? And all of a sudden the sale closed, and I'm able to pay for the seminary, for my attendance at seminary outright, and it was just this crazy trajectory. But I'll tell you, and I share this in the book, it's a hard thing to acknowledge our own ignorance. And for me, my own racism. And it's not that I want sympathy. My hope is that some of the time when we try to, like, help people see that particular ignorance in themselves and their inability to see it, is like, we all want to believe that we're good people, and so to identify racism in me, it really took a hard look, and it was a gravity moment for me where I was like, oh man, like, maybe I'm not as good as I thought, like, through God we can heal and grow closer to his image and closer to being the hands and feet of him in this world. And so in that particular struggle of mine with racism, which I'm still growing into this day, like, I'm no finished product, kind of like sobriety, at the end of the book, I parallel it to sobriety, right? Like, in the beginning, getting sober, it's hard to make it through a day. And then, like, the first year, it's like, well, it's hard to make it through your first holidays and your first party, and in this book, you'll see toward the end, okay, so I now can interact most of the time out of love, but, like, what happens when I go to a family holiday and somebody says something racist? What happens when a friend makes a racist remark? It's going through all these firsts, learning this new way of being in the world, that God has gracefully or graciously shown me. But there has been absolutely no experience more pivotal in my life, in the journey, with racism than attending that predominantly Black seminary school in Harlem, New York, as the only white student in my course. Especially, I don't know if you got to the part yet where they talk about the creation of the song Amazing Grace and how it was written. What?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So Amazing Grace, this beautiful hymn that's like, you know, one of the greats, you know, like if Christianity had like a greatest hits album, it would be on there. Like, it might even be number one, you know, but I didn't know that it was written by somebody who actively participated in the slave trade, you know, like on the ship. And, you know, like, and I talk about it in the book, but it's like, I learned that in my class, where our professor was sharing that. And I share pretty brutally and pretty candidly what it's like to be a white person in that scenario, like the only white person in the class, hearing that story, learning that, you know, like, and it's like, it's not about me, but like going through those situations, I can only feel what I feel. And so, you know, it's uncomfortable for me. It was uncomfortable for me to go through, but what I found from readers is that they reach out to me and they say, like, it's like I wrote this book. You know, one reader said, you know, it's like holding up a mirror. Like I could have written this book with my thoughts. I had, and she said, you know, I had no idea that this was even in me. And to be honest, you know, taking it full circle to addiction, the best, the most impactful person in my life, maybe with regard to addiction, was a man who on the outside, we had nothing in common, but I heard him share what it was like to experience addiction. And when he shared that from a firsthand perspective, he wasn't wagging a finger at me like so many people did, like you're a low down, no good drunk, you know, like, which people could say with good reason. But it's like, he wasn't wagging a finger in my face like you're an alcoholic, you're an addict. It was all, he was talking about himself. And it allowed me, as an observer of him telling that story, to sit back, exhale, and relate to him and say, you know what? Yeah, I am too, you know? And my hope with this book was to write something in such a way where people might, because I'm not wagging any fingers, because it's literally all about me and the hate that was in me and like how viscerally uncomfortable I am in certain situations, that people might be able to sit back, exhale, relate, and say, oh man, like me too. And you know, it's crazy. Like I thought that there would be this. I thought,
Hey, I apologize.
so no worries. I'll just, if you're cool with it, I'll just jump right back in because I remember where I stopped.
Okay, go ahead.
If you think about how many people one person interacts with in their life, you know, like grocery store clerks, mailmen, you know, like people on the street while you're driving, you know, like strangers, neighbors, loved ones, family members. It's incredible. We live in this world where it's like, you know, you need 1 million followers to be important or something. But it's like, when we really look at how many people we interact with in this world, if we change how we interact with those people in this world and we come at it with the love of Jesus Christ and the gospel of Jesus Christ that I was not only taught about and talked to about, but shown in that classroom, I mean, that's how the world changes. Okay. But basically, you know, he talks about how it's important to share the gospel one-on-one. And I feel like through this book, I hopefully am able to share how the gospel of Jesus Christ changed me, and having that one-on-one relationship with the reader, with the book in their hand. And, you know, hopefully if they have anything in their heart that they're not aware of, then hopefully it shows that. And if not, hopefully it's just a darn good story for them to read. So, you know, hopefully it's a win either way.
Yeah, it's a win either way. And it's interesting, my experience, because my dad is Black, my mom is white. And so I had a unique experience when I was reading some of your college experiences. I would have people talk in front of me and not know who they were talking in front of. And there were times when I would be really, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's like,
yeah. And
go ahead.
yeah. And it's so hard, right? Because like, I include a warning at the front of the book, and I'm like, part one, like you're going to be uncomfortable at various parts of the book. Part one, you're going to be really uncomfortable at certain parts. And it's interesting too to hear from somebody who is not, who is a person of color, their experience, because I was worried that those stories in particular would be very triggering. But I also had this thought where it's like, I feel like it's important to talk about these. And I tried to account for that, where I say, like, in the story of the young lady who was half Black and half white in my sorority in college. And I share that, like, she had kind of an awkward laugh in trying to kind of navigate this conversation. But it's like, I tried to account for that with the hopes that readers would see it and kind of be like, oh, wait, yeah, like we all are having this experience, and we all don't really know how to be in it. Like there's no training that we receive in school about, if somebody says something that makes you uncomfortable, how do you speak up about that? Like that's something I'm still learning to this day. And so, yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to hear, your experience reading it. And if I'm sure there was a lot of empathy for those characters in the book, knowing those experiences firsthand, because
Yeah.
I certainly had empathy for them now, looking back and seeing how oblivious and ignorant I was.
Well, it's interesting, and I don't want to, throw labels around or whatever, but I didn't see you as racist. What I saw was bias, but I think all of us have that. I mean, reading about your father and some of the things that he said, some of the ways that your mom responded, like when you wanted the black doll and she's like, no, that's not going to happen.
Right.
So coming from that kind of a background, and not being a hateful person. So what I saw in you was this insightful, very self-aware, even when you were drinking, very self-aware person who had biases. And the truth is, I don't know why that makes me want to cry, but it
makes you want to cry.
What?
It makes you want to cry.
It makes me want to cry to tell you this, that I didn't see you. I thought you were going to write, when I first saw your Instagram about writing this book, I'm like, okay, she's going to be like this, white pride, white nationalist person or whatever to the extreme. And what I saw was somebody who had biases, but in spite of your parents, especially your dad, and his sort of really clear stance. And then even your story about the young man that you briefly dated and you were told you couldn't. And then you looked at him as a senior in high school and he hadn't impregnated anybody like everybody thought.
Right.
And I think reading it, it was interesting to hear your thoughts, because you were so articulate about everything that you think. Like you write stuff that nobody would dare write, or admit that they're thinking. And so there were examples like you were on the bus or the subway and there's a Black woman sitting and you thought you deserved to sit more so than she did.
Right. And that was the moment I realized, like, oh my, like, I'm racist. Like that was the moment where I realized that I'm racist, and it had never dawned on me, and I think it's interesting that, because there is a spectrum, right, of like, and I talk about this at one point in the book where it's like, I always thought when I heard the word racist, I thought of some like one-tooth, a whole stereotype that comes to mind when we think of racism, white pride and white supremacy and all of that. And there are those individuals, but I also shared in that moment where I was thinking about that, it's like, maybe that's a convenient definition though of racism, because it allows us to kind of kick the can down the road and postpone dealing with the more normal, like normalized racism, or nuanced, exactly. Like, because I had one reviewer read my book and say, like, she had a very typical upbringing in suburban America in the 20th century or whatever. And then another one said her upbringing was extremely dysfunctional and racist. And I looked at those two and I was like, maybe they're both true to some degree, because a lot of this has been normalized. And like, I think that when we push the definition of racism so far, that's just its expression. What I really want in my own life, and my prayer for everybody, is that in their heart, the motive and the incentive for their actions to be rooted in love and the gospel of Jesus Christ, and the knowledge that we are all born in the image of God, and there is not a single person or group of people who is born more in the image of God than anyone else, you know. And I think that when we operate under the opposite understanding, we need to look at that. And whether we call it full-blown racism or we call it bias or whatever, for me, it's just like, man, I've seen God work so many miracles in my life. And like I said, when I like something, I like it a lot. You know, I want all of it. I'm going for the record. Like, I want all the miracles he can work in my life. I'm going to let him. And so it's like, if there is a part of my heart that is not as aligned with him as it could be, I'm bringing it to him, you know, and I want to experience all of that so that I can then hopefully be that and help other people see that they can reach that too through him, is reach transcendence from that hate and that just the lack of love, you know, that can seem so prevalent in our society today.
I think that your voice is really important because you're coming from where you're coming from. Your perspective is going to appeal, and I think more people are going to hear you that maybe wouldn't hear somebody who's of color, because it's easy to dismiss somebody else's experience and say, you know, or to think it's extreme, like it has to be extreme. Right. You have to be in the woods or whatever. But your experience and your like nuanced racism, which, you know, call it what it is, that idea that some people are better, some people that God, you know, came specifically for America and specifically for a group of people in America. And instead of, you know, the basics, John 3:16, that God came, or God, now I can't even think of the scripture. It's the most basic scripture.
He so loved the world. He so loved the world, the whole world, not just some of the world. It's a great point.
Yeah. So, and now, okay, so I know what you're up to now. You're all over Instagram. You are literally now on my feed. Like the algorithm has switched.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's awesome. So like every day you're my first little person to see.
Oh, that's deeply humbling. So I am on Instagram. And just to go back real fast, you know, because when I felt called to write this book, I looked around. I was in the plane to our honeymoon, and I looked around this plane, and my husband was asleep, and I just looked up and I was like, you want me to write what? And you know what you made me look like, right? And you want me to write a book about racism. And then 2020 happened and the book wasn't done. And I thought I'd somehow screwed it up because, like, you know, I've been told that I have all this potential, but I never follow through, and I'm lazy and I, you know, procrastinate. And so here I thought my sins were bigger than the will of God. And I was like, oh, I screwed it up. My book should have come out now. And I felt God lay on my heart so gently and say, it's not your time. Like, there are readers right now who are reading Black authors who would have never read Black. It's not your time. Right now is the time for those authors, and your time will come later. And what I found in praying about this book and finally having it be published now in springtime 2023 is I felt God say on one occasion, like a few months before publishing, your time is when the feel like it wears off. And I know, as somebody who's struggled with eating right, was struggled with addiction, was struggled with all these things, there's a point where the enthusiasm of the initial moment wears off and the feel like it wears off. And you still got to put your tennis shoes on and go running. You still got to, you know, get up, say your prayers, and stay sober. You still got to show up for what needs to be shown up for. And I just felt him say, your story is for when the feel like it wears off. When the enthusiasm to read Black authors is done, you know.
Wow. That's huge, because, you know, it's funny about that too. Not only the enthusiasm to read Black authors, but there was an enthusiasm for, you know, equity and inclusion and diversity and all of those like trainings and things like that. And that enthusiasm seems to have waned.
Well, and that's the other thing, you know, like I follow a lot of Black leaders, especially Christian leaders, but like influencers and stuff on social media. And a few months prior to publishing this book, I felt like every time I was logging in, I would see people say, you know, the Black people I was following, they would say how weary they are and how tired they are
yeah.
and exhausted and like honestly like disillusioned and disheartened by the fact that the feel like it was wearing off. You know, and then I'll share this with you, and I share this in humility. I was praying about it one night as I was driving by myself, and I was listening to a song by Blessing Offer, which if you haven't, it's the song, Change is Gonna Come was the song. And I felt God lay on my heart, 2020 was for the frontline soldiers, and you are not a frontline soldier. You are part of the cavalry. And when I looked up that word, I didn't even know what it meant, but I looked it up, and it's basically like reinforcement troops that come at the last moment to give help and assistance. And like the fact that I could be part of that is deeply humbling. And, you know, with every reader that contacts me and says like, I didn't know I had this in me, but now I do. And now I got to do something about it, you know, and I've had several. It's like, they're part of the cavalry now, you know, and we're all coming along and we're all joining. And it's, while the frontline soldiers are weary, there are more soldiers who are coming.
That's huge. Thank you for sharing that. I'm glad you shared that. I'm going to hold up your book again. Let's pray for them, Trisha Fenimore, and you can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble.
I don't know if you can get it on Barnes & Noble yet, but it is on Amazon. It's on Apple iBooks, Google Store, Kindle, Kobo, and you can find it, you know, online in a couple different places. But I'm not sure if Barnes & Noble has it just yet. But we'll see, maybe, hopefully.
But a warning about this book: it'll keep you up. I just can't stop turning the page, and I'm like literally going, okay, I'm going to sit it over here. I'm not reading anymore tonight. I need some rest. So, thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
So I was just saying that your Instagram is at Trisha, Trisha Fenimore, Fenimore.
Yep, Trisha Fenimore on Instagram, and that's mainly my main platform. I'm nowhere else. You can find me there.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and keep doing what you're doing because it's making a huge difference.
Thank you so much, Monika. This was such a lovely experience, and truly I'm honored and humbled that you asked me, and what a privilege it was to get to know you better. Thank you so much.
Well,
God bless
have a great day, and God bless you too. Thank you. Oops.